Good morning, everybody. We have sort of a sadder show for you today. We're going to be talking about the insane, tragic events that have been going on in Afghanistan these past few weeks, but also over the past 20 years, which feels crazy to say. Good morning, Alex. How are you doing?
Life is oftentimes filled with these things, and our foreign policy has been robustly terrible for my entire life. So it is not shocking. But in the chaos, I actually see a glimmer of hope that, in fact, people are understanding that these forever wars make no sense, and that there is no winning a war with no objective. I am really happy to be joined today by an expert who can sort of tell me more and let me know if my understanding makes any sense. Stephen Miles is the executive director of Win Without War and a foreign policy expert. Stephen, thanks for joining us on Solidarity Live.
Yeah, I normally would say happy to be here, but of course, I would rather not have to be talking about these horrible situations, but I am looking forward to the conversation.
So just start us off with just sort of a baseline to bring us all up to speed. I will just admit, I read the news all the time, maybe obsessively news junkie style, but I definitely have a domestic policy focus. And I really roundly reject American imperialism, which I think of as the need for these wars to be all over the place that basically serve to enrich these private corporations, these beltway bandits. And it's part and parcel of the stuff we talk about, where you have these super rich people who are profiting off of a system that's not broken. It's just created to benefit them. It's not created to keep us safe, or then the military industrial complex. I think their myth is that that the all of the armaments are keeping us safe. But I look around and I'm like, well, that's just not true. So that's sort of where I come to it from. But I do not have a very nuanced understanding of what has been happening in Afghanistan and what led to what we're seeing on TV. I really think we should get out of Afghanistan. I think we should have gotten out of Afghanistan a long time ago if we ever should have been there in the first place. But right now, it looks really bad. It seems super chaotic. Like, was no one in charge? So maybe just start with the baseline so that we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, actually your framing is somewhat helpful, because it is helpful to think of U.S. foreign policy in a similar way to what you were talking about, which is that we have a foreign policy making system that's deeply broken, deeply corrupt, and in which we are not making policies or pursuing policies that are either supported by the American public or work for the betterment of the people in the countries in which we're often operating. And so, unfortunately, what brings us here today is the scenes that we're seeing play out in Kabul and across Afghanistan as the Taliban has taken over control of the country, and as the U.S. is in the stages of an evacuation in which they're trying to get both U.S. citizens as well as a number of Afghans who hold visas and others who need refuge or safety from danger from the Taliban out of the country. That is actually part and parcel of what we've seen over the last 20 years of the U.S. military occupation in Afghanistan, in which seldom has the beneficiary been the safety and security of the Afghan people. Seldom has that been the motivation, and seldom has that been the primary outcome. Meanwhile, we've seen 2 decades of war, which, as you said, have made a number of folks very, very wealthy, whether they were the arms makers, whether they were the corrupt Afghan officials, or whether they were the insurgency itself, which often fed indirectly off of the occupation through some of those corrupt deals. A lot of people have a hand in this, but it's harder to have a conversation about it unless we take this step back and we begin to look at what we've been doing over the last 20 years of our military occupation, and remembering that our military involvement in Afghanistan goes back even further, back to the Soviet invasion in the days of the Mujahideen. So it's really in the neighborhood of 4 decades that the United States has been militarily involved in Afghanistan. And of course, to bring it back to this moment, we are seeing mistakes that were made as part of this. As part of this withdrawal, we're seeing an urgent need to save human lives and to do evacuations. But a war that we had 20 years of failure after failure, mistake after mistake, it was unlikely that we were suddenly going to get it all right in the end. And unfortunately, as has often been the case, the people who bear the brunt of those mistakes and failures are not those of us here in the United States, but the people of Afghanistan.
Well, and I mean, obviously, you know this, Stephen, but if you've somehow missed this, the images coming out are it's just terrifying. People clinging onto planes and falling to their death in their urgency to get out. And I think what's maybe missing from the context of these is this was entirely unnecessary. President Biden made the decision to evacuate in April. There was a very different way this could have gone. I mean, am I incorrect about that, Stephen?
Again, I think you have to put it in context and look, there is going to be a time and a place to examine the mistakes that the Biden administration made. And certainly there were some. No one will say there haven't been, but you have to contextualize the reality that this didn't start. You know, the United States, President Barack Obama announced the drawdown of U.S. forces from Afghanistan in 2011. It was supposed to be completed in 2014, 7 years ago. We've stayed through that time. President Obama did not fully draw down because he felt it was not his place to hand over a country in which he had just completed a drawdown. But President Trump at the time first surged into Afghanistan. In fact, the years during his presidency, the U.S. dropped more ordnance, dropped more bombs on Afghanistan than any other year in the war. They were some of the deadliest years for Afghan civilians during his presidency. And of course, famously for political reasons, let's remember, for his own personal political belief was that it would be to his benefit to withdraw from Afghanistan before the election, arranged for the final U.S. drawdown, reaching a deal with the Taliban in Doha about a year and a half ago, in which a May deadline was set for a complete withdrawal of forces. So President Biden came into office in January with the question, would he complete that drawdown of the final 2,500 U.S. forces that were in the country or not? And in April, as you said, he announced that he would in fact complete that, not by the May deadline, but by over the course of the summer. So this has been a long time in the making. You can't think about, I can't think about the situation we're seeing now and wonder if President Trump had not spent the last year of his presidency thinking about ways he could use the military against Black Lives Matter protesters, had not spent the final months of his presidency denying that he had lost an election and having a transition in which the Biden administration had access to agencies like the Pentagon to plan for these kinds of events, had not spent his entire energy doing nothing to make sure that this policy that he was directing his government to pursue would actually be followed through, where that would have left us. And so I do think, as I said, I think President Biden's administration will need to answer for any mistakes they may have made during this period. I think we have to look to President Trump and his administration for the clear mistakes they made. We have to ask questions about President Obama's decision to surge. And of course, we can't lose sight of the fact that all of this started 20 years ago with President George W. Bush, and it didn't need to, and we can't absolve him of his mistakes either.
Oh man, can we not absolve President Bush of his
mistakes? Did you hear he paints you guys though? Maybe
he does paint. He does paint, and I guess he's friends with Michelle Obama. I sort of came a lot of my I was politically aware, but the lead up to the Iraq War was a big part of my eye-opening at how the system actually works, that there's this corrupt partnership between the war pigs and the corporate media, who the corporate media literally love nothing more than war. It is what they live for. There is not a liberal corporate media when it comes to war. They are absolutely shameless. And, not to make light of it, but it's the only thing you can do is laugh or cry when you see some of this stuff. They're like, and now to comment on Joe Biden's failures to protect Americans, we're going to turn to Schmucky McSchmuckface, who's never been right about a single thing that he's ever said, ever, about foreign policy. and he's always wrong in the direction of Raytheon and the other Beltway bandits who just happen to pay him millions of dollars a year. Schmucky McSmuckface, here you go. And then the person's like, war is the only answer. Peace is at the point of at the barrel of a gun, right? I mean, they are bloodthirsty. They marched us into Iraq war. We knew it was all lies. Hundreds of thousands of people came out, ringed the White House, and there were millions of people around the world out in the streets. And the corporate media would find like one patchouli-soaked, pot-smoking hippie and be like, why are people out here today? And then they'd be like, Bush sucks. And they're like, the whole movement, they'd be like, well, they don't even know why they're out marching today. And like, it was amazing to me to watch because I'm like, I was actually part of the team that helped coordinate the church buses. I was the one who told the churches where to park. Buses and buses of people. But that's what the media does. They really try to smash this down to make the story really easy, which is anything that is withdrawing or going against American imperialism and American war is bad because it leads to chaos and terrorism and all of this stuff. And you're like, are you sure it's not bombing civilians that leads to terrorism? Are you sure it's not actually arming the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets that didn't create the Taliban? Are you positive that it wasn't our Cold War partner in Pakistan and the ISI who was trained by the CIA to create paramilitary forces? The Taliban that are to blame? Are you positive? So I know that's a lot, Stephen, but like that's why I watch so much domestic policy, because when I turn to foreign policy, I get so angry at how it is almost impossible to distinguish between left, foreign policy and right foreign policy when it comes to this elite foreign policy that exists in America, which seems to be capable of only one thing: war, for no reason. Like, I always ask, what was the purpose 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? What were we going to accomplish in Afghanistan? What were the troops doing there? So that's not a question. That was just a rant from me, Stephen. So take that where you will.
It's your show. I think you're allowed to rant. I think that's the way the rules work. I mean, look, the reality, you're right. The reality is there is a consensus of the DC foreign policy establishment that's been very hawkish and very interventionist and pro-war for a long time. One of the things about Afghanistan that's so important is we actually have insight into the realities of how they thought about the war through what was known as the Afghanistan Papers that the Washington Post published recently, and along with others, which reveal that for years, throughout pretty much the entirety of the war, exactly what you said, we were all feeling that there was no purpose, there was confusion, it was unclear what the mission was, that the partners we were working with in Afghanistan were corrupt, that this was not something that was going to work, was what they said behind closed doors. Yet when they got in front of a camera, they said, we're turning the corner. In 6 months, we'll see really good progress. There's an old cliche that we've been turning the corner so many times we're spinning in circles. And it holds true when you look at what has been said about Afghanistan. Look, we are in the middle right now, as we are talking, of a humanitarian crisis in which our number 1, 2, 3 through every priority has to be saving as many Afghan lives as possible, getting folks who are at the airport out and getting others who need safe refuge out to the airport. That should be our number 1 priority. But there is going to be a time to talk about what went wrong. And you cannot look at what happened over the last several weeks, the collapse of the Afghan government, the collapse of the Afghan security forces, and not think about the billions is an understatement, the hundreds of billions of dollars that the United States poured into this, the 20 years that we poured into this, the thousands of American lives lost, the tens of thousands of Afghan lives lost, and ask yourselves, how in God's name did we not grapple with these failures sooner? How did we allow this to go on for 20 years? I think you're right. The media bears a large burden of responsibility for that. We've been talking about the images on TV the last couple of days. I think that's right, and I think they are heartbreaking. Where was Afghanistan on TV the last couple of years as we were having record numbers of Afghan civilians die. Afghanistan, like much of the rest of the world, is dealing with the consequences of climate change. There are climate-related disasters of drought and other challenges that have been causing internal displacement and suffering in Afghanistan. Where is the news media's coverage of that? We can't only let our news media focus on something when there are telegenic weapons exploding in a way that make for good ratings, and then wonder why the only thing we talk about is war. There is a systemic failure, and we have to start to grapple with that.
Well, and Stephen, you commented on this before. Like, so what? How can we be supportive to refugees right now? What are things that people should be organizing for right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing we need to remember is that we need to keep the political pressure up. The Biden administration is taking a number of steps to evacuate people. We need to keep the pressure up for them to do more, do it faster, and continue at it until the job's done. Progressives have always rejected the notion that the only way we care about a country is when we're bombing them, that the only way we care about a people in a country is if we send our forces to invade and occupy them. That is not the reality. And this is a moment for progressives to show and stand up and make clear that we care deeply about Afghanistan and deeply about the people of Afghanistan. And for those whom we can evacuate, that means evacuation. But after the evacuation, there will remain tens of millions of people in Afghanistan, many of whom are in need of humanitarian aid and assistance because of various different situations. We need to keep the pressure up for our government to continue funding that. We need to keep the pressure up for our government to deal with what are going to be some of the inevitable challenges and consequences of the Taliban takeover. There is going to be a continued humanitarian crisis, and shame on us if we allow our attention to turn away once the last US forces leave. So we have demands that we have to make right now, but it's also on us as progressives to make sure that in a month and in a year and in 10 years, we are keeping the pressure up on our government to continue to address the humanitarian crisis that will be in Afghanistan. Because look, we have a moral responsibility. You cannot militarily occupy a country for 20 years. You cannot be militarily involved in a country for 4 decades and then say, hey, sorry, you've got problems, not our fault. It is our fault. It is the reality that we bear a moral responsibility. That means opening our doors to Afghans who need safety and refuge, and it means bearing the costs of dealing with the consequences of our 20 years of war.
So, Jocelyn, you have more?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to note something that applies to, unfortunately, more than just Afghanistan. You know, one of our blind spots as American voters is that we play such an outsized role in foreign policy that every other country in the world is hyper vigilant and aware of. But we live in this myopic space because, Stephen, you're absolutely correct. Like we see these things when they're in the state either of trauma or tragedy or like some big thing just happened. But the reality is our political cycle is on everyone else's news screens constantly because other countries, especially countries that we're regularly militarily engaging with, are incredibly aware that what we do and how we vote is going to impact their world in an outsized way. And that is something like in a broad way that needs to be discussed a lot more in this country because we are both literally and figuratively isolated. You know, we're over here, but like you go anywhere else in the world and they know what's going on in American politics because it's going to affect them in a very real and essential way. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Alex. What were you going to say?
No, well, let me jump in here because I think you're hitting on 2 really important points. The first is, we as progressives like to talk about how those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. Those closest to the pain should be closest to the solutions. Nowhere is that farther from the truth than U.S. foreign policy. And we have to grapple with that as progressives, that by and large, the folks on the receiving end of U.S. foreign policy and national security decisions, the folks who bear the burden of our decisions made in Washington, D.C., are not only not at the decision-making table, we often don't hear their voices. Alex was talking earlier about the U.S. news media. How many times do we all have to hear from John Bolton, right? Could they not possibly have found an Afghan to talk about Afghanistan? Could we not have spent some of the last couple of days listening to Afghan voices about what they wanted for their country and their family instead of the very generals who have been perpetuating a war for 20 years? This system is very broken, and we have to start to grapple with that. Again, this is larger, the systemic change. We need to deal with these things over quite some time. This is not the crisis of the moment, but the crisis of the moment is connected into this systemic failure. But the second part that I want to come to of what you said is the American public's perception of foreign policy. There's a cliche in this town that the American public doesn't care about foreign policy, and it's frankly deeply untrue. It's that we have a foreign policy decision-making system that ignores, negates, and otherwise relegates the American public's opinions irrelevant. So the American public has been opposed to a U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan for a long time. They've supported drawing down U.S. troops for well over a decade at this point. They view the war as a mistake by 2/3 in the latest polling. But that hasn't corresponded into the actions of the United States government. It's corresponded into the statements of politicians over time, right? Donald Trump didn't have deeply held views on Afghanistan. I think we can all accept that, right? I don't think we think he put his policy hat on and analyzed the situation. He stuck his finger in the wind and said, "Oh, look, the public wants to get out. They'll like me if I get us out." And so he was responding to that. Of course, he did it in the most incompetent, corrupt, inept way imaginable. But the public's view on this was often was very, very, very seldom taken into consideration in our policymaking. Look, the public view started to change on this war after the 2008 financial crisis, right? When we suddenly had this economic crisis at home, and frankly, one that corresponded to folks around the world. And the American public began to say, really, what are we doing in Iraq and Afghanistan? Look at these challenges we have here. And all of our national attention is focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. That public sentiment really solidified in 2011 with the killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, which only reinforced in the American public's mind. The public supported the war initially because it was about 9/11. In the days after 9/11 and the weeks and months after 9/11, the notion was this was the war to respond to 9/11. This was about Al-Qaeda. This was about Osama bin Laden. Now, 2011, you have Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of 9/11, the leader of Al-Qaeda, killed in another country. That really solidified for the public, why are we here? If the extent to this war was about anything for the American public, it was about 9/11. That's now past. Let's get out, right? Let's get out. But again, for a decade, despite the public's clear position on that, that didn't matter. And people will say, well, there wasn't marches on Washington against the war like there was in Vietnam. Yeah, we've created a system whereby Americans don't personally feel the costs of the war. Back to what I said earlier, the people who feel the costs of the war are completely shut out of the political system, both the Afghans in Afghanistan, but also the diaspora here in the United States, which are relegated and pushed out of political conversations. So you then add in a tiny percentage of Americans are serving in the U.S. military these days, and we're experiencing the unbelievable burdens of this war. Not just the 2,500 who died, the 20,000 who are injured, those who came home and have been dealing with the after effects, the invisible wounds of war, PTSD, and other things, the family members who surrounded them. It's an enormous amount of people, but it's a small percentage of the American public. And then, of course, the $2 trillion we've spent on this war has been largely on the credit card, the nation's credit card. The U.S. public was never made to pay a war tax or in any way pay for this war like we were during previous wars. So the public was kind of not forced to grapple with these unimaginable costs financially that we were putting on. And so you get that all together. Sure, people didn't march in the streets. They weren't feeling the urgency of it the way they might have felt the urgency of their home being foreclosed on, losing their healthcare or other crises. But it didn't mean they didn't care. They cared. They made their opinions known. It was our policymakers who didn't listen to them.
I have lots of thoughts. I think that's super important, what you just said. That's what I was trying to get at in my rant. I was watching people's voice. It was there. People were like, no. I mean, there were some people who were saying yes, but it was at the very least a debate. But in policy land, it was absolutely one-sided. And Fred Hyatt at the Washington Post, who lied us into war, right? I mean, just like cheering the whole way. He's never apologized. He's still there in charge. That's the problem. All of these people are still there, still in charge, and they're the ones who get brought on TV. They're like, what do you think? Mr. has never gotten anything right?
I know this will shock you, Alex, but there's a decided lack of accountability in Washington, D.C.
That does shock
me. I know, outrageous to say, but it's true. Look, and that lack of accountability, again, the people who bear the costs of that are Afghans, Syrians, Iraqis, Yemenis, Somalis, right? They are the ones bearing the burden of these repeated failures of these, like, and let's be clear, it's mostly old white guys. These old white guys who are making decisions sitting in Washington about the fate and the lives of people who say, you know, this idea hasn't worked for the last 19 years, but what if we just try it one more time? What if this is the year that we bomb Iraq enough that suddenly it becomes peaceful and everything is great there? There is no accountability for that. And that's an across the board problem in our politics, obviously, but it's a particularly acute problem in foreign policy. And we need to begin to change that. Maybe a little bit of a ray of hope here is we've begun to change who we send to Washington. And that's begun to change this, right? So when you look at someone like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, right, a Somali refugee who herself knows the realities of what these are like, one of the moments that really caught attention was when she was questioning Elliot Abrams early on in the Trump administration, who had been made the special envoy for human rights in Venezuela, or for a special envoy for Venezuela. This is a man who was convicted of lying to Congress around human rights abuses in Latin America, testifying to Congress about what he was going to do about human rights abuses in Latin America. I mean, it's not even ironic. Like, I don't know what the word is for how absurd that is. So Congresswoman Omar said, this is absurd. This is ridiculous. How do you have any credibility to speak about these issues? And Elliot Abrams was outraged. He huffed and puffed. He was furious. But we're beginning to see at least some folks who are questioning those issues and who are trying to hold accountable and say, look, if you literally were found guilty of lying to Congress, maybe you are not the one we should have testifying in front of Congress. If you were involved in covering up mass human rights abuses, maybe we shouldn't put you in the government in charge of protecting human rights, right? This is a repeated problem. It goes far beyond one individual, and we need to begin to grapple with it.
Yes, I agree with all of that. And I will also say that it's a difficult place we find ourselves in, progressives, right now, because, and I'm going to try to put my thinking out here so no one has to sign off on it. But President Biden was handed a giant flaming bag of poo by the last administration, just like, ha ha ha, that's yours. Trump's defense secretary, Esper, went on television and said basically that. It's the buck stops with Biden. And something that I really respect about Biden is that he went on television and said that the buck stops with me. It's me. I have a moral responsibility. I'm going to own all of this chaos, but I'm not going to do what previous administrations have done, which is say, well, exiting is too hard, so I'm going to just kick it into the future. And I will critique I have a story to tell about how most things that seem malicious are actually just incompetent, and the more complex it gets, and there's corruption involved, but like, man, don't overrate or underrate the power of just fumbling. That it's really hard to get things right. And when the incentives were all skewed to begin with, for example, the intelligence assessments that are coming in that are like, 90 days, the Taliban won't be able to take over in 90 days. Where was that coming from? Because it took days for them to take over, right? It's like, again, what about accountability for being super wrong? Like when the intelligence community missed the fall of the Soviet Union, missed 9/11, missed all sorts of stuff. These are difficult areas, but to me, that we're leaving Afghanistan is militarily is a good thing. We have to come up with a new worldview of global solidarity where we're able to engage with other countries, not just with bullets and bombs, but we're saying, like, look, the Taliban are horrible. They do horrible things. There are horrible people all over the place. We should be saying the Taliban is not representative of the Afghan people. They're going to pay a price for the fact that the Taliban is taking over the country, not only taking over the country, but also has all of the military equipment, all of the stuff that we gave to the supposed Afghan government, which was really just what's the right word? It's not a stalking horse, but it was a figment of our imagination. It did not exist without us, without the U.S. military. As soon as the U.S. military was saying we're out, the president just left with $136 million, supposedly, right? I mean, like, this is the reality, but the answer to that can't be, oh, well, then we'll just have to stay, right? Yeah. Like, oh, well, Trump did this bad deal and released the Taliban and put us on a stupid deadline that was too aggressive and it would lead to chaos. And so therefore, let's just stay militarily. That's how we end up in wars for 20 years, forever wars and whatnot. Yeah. So I want to do one more setup, and we have a little bit of time, so I'll go fast, but I want that. What is the progressive? You are so rare in this town, Stephen, because progressive foreign policy is really not, it's difficult. And I want to hear from you, like, what is it that we should be pushing? I mean, I know what I push, which is just the war pigs are literally always wrong. They're never right. And so you're like, who said that? A war pig? Yeah, they're wrong. Do the opposite of that. But I'd like it to be more, I want someone to have more thought into it than me. So I'm hoping you can answer that. But then I want to lay this out, and you don't have to say I'm correct, but I want people to know this. In the Cold War, India was allied with the Soviet Union, and America was allied with Pakistan. And we created a proxy war between two nations that have an enormous amount of animosity towards each other anyways. And we have long used fundamentalist religion as a paramilitary wing to fight the communists. That's what we did in Iran. That led to the, I can go on and on. These are all like things that we do. But the thing that's boggling my mind, because we gave the Mujahideen the weapons to defeat the Soviets. They were fed by the ISI, which is the Pakistani intelligence community, which has got to be one of the scariest entities in the world, trained by our security apparatus. All of that was in existence in 2001, right? When we invaded, we knew. I don't understand that. Like, how come no one at the CIA was like, hey guys, the Taliban are actually run out of the ISI, and as long as that exists, they're not going to go away. They will never, they have a base of power that is not actually in the countries or the cities where we're saying we can project power. How come no one said that? How come no one said, so therefore we should be in a stance of negotiating to get what we want, which is Osama bin Laden? And I'll sort of like end with, and where was Osama bin Laden when we had to send a team into another country to kill him? He was in Pakistan, down the road from a military base. So like, I don't understand why on one hand you have this security apparatus in America that's like bloodthirsty, cloak and dagger, and they do all these things to advance supposedly our interests around the world. But then a military apparatus that just like pretends that none of that exists, right? And is like, oh, they'll welcome us as liberators or whatnot. So like that part is where I would like to get, like, how do we break that down? What is the progressive way to say, stop all this dumb stuff that leads to blowback every single time? It's never worked. And usually it ends in catastrophe or forever war. So with all that, Stephen, please solve everything for us and tell us as progressives what we can do. I'm looking for, what does global solidarity look like that fights against this imperialism, but is not, saying, well, then we have to get in, we have to back horrible, bloodthirsty dictators who are on the other side of that, right? Yeah. Like that sort of tanky phenomenon is just as dumb as our foreign policy. There's a way that we can do this with global solidarity, and I'm hoping you can kind of spell out a little bit what that looks like.
Yeah, I think one of the ways it starts is with a recognition that the differences between our domestic and our foreign policy are not as great as we think, and we don't have to look at the world with one set of values when we look domestically and another as we look internationally. And so, why do I say that? We've had a lot of conversations in this country over the last year and then some about how the militarization of our police departments, how the militarization of our streets here do not make our communities safer, right? How trying to terrorize people does not actually bring safety and security, does not make our community safer. The same holds true internationally, right? We do not make anywhere safer by terrorizing people locally. We do not make places safer with bombs and bullets and over militarization. We know that. We know that to be true when we think about our own communities, and that holds true exactly as much when we think internationally. So we have to apply that value consistently at home and abroad, right? When we think about what's happening in the United States and when we think about what's happening abroad. But that also brings us to why is it so hard for progressive foreign policy? And that's because the only tool foreign policy that we have really invested in as a country for decades is the United States military. The Pentagon consumes an ungodly amount of resources. They are up over $750 billion a year, every year. And that's not counting, like it is in many other countries who also have to pay their veterans and others in parts of the military, healthcare systems and things like that. That's all elsewhere in our government. We are just talking about $750 billion, over half of which goes to private contractors, goes to private companies every year. It is an ungodly sum of money that has built an amazingly large and powerful military and has deprived us of investments in any other tool of foreign policy. We do have a State Department, we do have USAID, we have diplomacy, we have development. They are so unbelievably under-resourced when you compare them to the military. It defies understanding if you don't live with it every day.
Why do I add something there just that I know from is that under-resourcing means that they have to play second fiddle to the military as well. So therefore they become oftentimes like a facsimile of it, right? Like they don't have the resources to do the things they want. They rely on the military to do that. And then the old adage of if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So it is by design.
That's exactly where I was going. And look, the reality is that when that is the only tool, when there are crises, when there are things that happen in the world and we have to respond to them, suddenly the only tool at our dispense to respond is the United States military. So that is what people go to, right? When there is a crisis, when there was an Ebola crisis in West Africa a number of years ago, where did people ultimately turn? They said the United States military. That's who we have to use to respond because that's the only tool that we can. So every time we try to have this conversation, we're lurching from crisis to crisis to crisis. And in that crisis, our priority, as we've talked about here, is saving lives. Right? It is doing what we can to save as many people. And so people look around and they say, well, the US military is the only thing we have to do that. That makes sense a lot of times in the moment, why people go there. But we've seen time and time again that it fails. We've seen time and time again that it doesn't work. We have to take the long view and we have to begin to invest in other forms of foreign policy. Progressive foreign policy has to be about internationalism. It has to be about problem solving. Look, we have to solve the climate crisis. It is existential to humanity. Solving that crisis is something that has to be done globally and internationally, and that has to be the core of a progressive foreign policy. Guess what? The United States military is the largest carbon polluter in the country, right? Yet we have to grapple with these understandings. We have to say we have money to solve the problems we face. We have resources to deal with pandemics, to deal with climate crisis, to deal with the other threats that we face, but we're not spending them on solutions to those problems. We're just spending them on the United States military. That is until we solve that, until we start to reimagine security for this country and the world, we are going to find ourselves right back in situations like this, where we are lamenting tragic scenes unfolding on our television screens, where we are doing everything we can to save lives, but we have ultimately put ourselves in a position where, once again, we have not solved any problems, we have not made lives safer, and we don't have the solutions to the problems that we face.
So I can do one, like, and this might be a little spicy, but Cuba has this public health corps of doctors. This is a teeny tiny country that we have put
I was actually
under.
going to bring that up, so thank you for bringing it up, Alex.
Oh, well, you take it then.
Okay. All right. Well, fine. Yeah. So Cuba not only has an incredibly impressive and successful low incidence of a lot of the infectious disease epidemics that we've struggled with here, including COVID for a while. I think that kind of changed recently, but and they just send them out like public health missionaries to other surrounding Caribbean and other parts of the world too. Is that correct? Like, but they have
absolutely
this communal of doctors that are incredibly well trained in both medicine and public health. And it's just like this beautiful form of diplomacy that it's almost embarrassing. We should even be talking about that. Like, shouldn't we be doing that? Don't we have this like crazy high GDP and the best university in the world? Like, you know, the one good thing George Bush did was his action with HIV in Africa, but it's like, okay, we could be doing a lot more.
That's one idea of like what foreign policy could look like. Because, you know, Cuba, you know, it's not like Cuba's like, oh, yeah, they're the best in the world. They're doing it all for altruistic reasons. They're literally doing it because it makes people like them, right? Like that's what it helps them create allies and partners in solidarity, even though they are, you know, terrible in their own ways. But when a country is suffering and the military, you know, the U.S. is like, we can send in a bunch of Marines. And sometimes the countries are like, yeah, I guess we'll take a bunch of Marines. Maybe you could send some refrigerators with that. And like, you know, the pallets of bottled water that come with our Marines might actually be more useful than the Marines themselves. And Cuba is like, hey, we've got like 100 doctors who are trained in providing medical care in resource poor settings. Is that useful? And the countries are like, yes, imagine what we could do, $750 billion a year, man. The problem is that people hear big numbers all the time and they can't really understand what that is. Everything that you want, whoever you are watching it, every single policy that you want, we could pay for with that. It's a year, man. When you're usually seeing, sorry to go all over the place, but this is one of the things that just is mind-boggling once you understand it. When you see most big numbers in DC, that's over 10 years. And that's just our window that we use. When we're talking about Pentagon spending, we are talking about every single year, like clockwork. You could pay for all the things. Everyone gets free college and a toaster made out of platinum for every single person who goes to free college with free health care and a pony if you want. A year, man. We could do so much more than just bombs and bullets and destruction. And, you know, I don't even need to be super hippie about it. Those same Beltway bandits could make just as much money, right? Just as much money if they were creating, say, a distributed COVID vaccine that the U.S. government owns the patent of, and we build manufacturing capability around the world and end the pandemic globally and prevent the next pandemic, right? Like that is foreign policy. That's a foreign policy that would get people, the conversation would be like, hey, do you want to go commit terrorism against the United States? And another person would be like, I don't know, man. Those dudes built this factory that my brother's employed at that is producing vaccines, which have saved the lives of my family. No, I don't hate them. Where currently, sometimes those conversations are like, hey, do you want to go commit terrorism against the United States? And the response is, those guys bombed my brother's wedding because they thought it was a gathering of terrorists. Yes, I'm angry. And that sort of, it's so... the idea that things are like super duper complex and need to be super duper complex and that we don't understand the way the world works. I just reject that. They don't understand the way the world works. Their idiot ideas have failed forever. I don't know. You know better than me, but I'm pretty sure they've never actually succeeded. the last like unified foreign policy with military intervention that worked was World War II. So anyways, that the idea of what we can do if we imagine what foreign policy can look like, that's where my mind goes, because I'm a public healthy guy. But like, are there other models that you can point us to? And actually, Stephen, sorry, take us out on this one. So just and tell people where they can get involved. Paint us a beautiful picture of the world that we can all build together with progressive foreign policy through global solidarity, and how people can support your work at Win Without War, which in my eyes is like one of the only progressive foreign policy places, somebody who's working on this.
Yeah, look, there's a handful of us out there, but there's far too few. That goes without saying. The folks can go to our website, winwithoutwar.org, and get more information. There's all sorts of stuff, both about the current crisis in Afghanistan there, that you can get daily news roundups and analysis, as well as ways to take action. But to your point, there's also a statement of principles. There's a vision for what does progressive foreign policy look like? What would it look like to live our values as progressives globally, not just at home, and how do they interconnect? What does that look like? So you can find all of that again on our website at winwithoutwar.org. But I think you're right. Look, like, let me use one anecdote and one story to kind of tell this picture. There was a gentleman from Yemen that I had the pleasure to meet a number of years ago. He was in town to testify before Congress, and in his testimony, he talked about how for a long time the only thing that anybody knew in his village was about the United States was through him, right? We had brought him to the United States with State Department scholarship programs that we had educated him, we had helped him, we had helped make his life better. And that was the vision that people had of the United States until we dropped a bomb from a drone and on an alleged terrorist. And suddenly the United States was the place that rains down death and destruction from robots in the sky. And that was all anybody knew about the United States. We talked earlier about whether or not people care in this country, whether or not Americans care about foreign policy. I will argue, as long as I have oxygen, that people absolutely care about whether or not the United States' role in the world is to do good and to spread the benefits that we have of the wealth that we have in solidarity with other people, versus our role being one where we drop bombs, where we help facilitate famines, where we cause lots of suffering in the name of chasing down terrorists or some other military misadventure. People care about that. That's why you see those church buses coming to those anti-war protests, right? People want to be in solidarity with others around the world. We want others to have the chance to live lives in their own countries safely and securely. We want people to have the opportunity to end their night, put their heads down when they go to bed with a full stomach and not wondering where their next meal will come from. People care deeply about these issues, and when they want their government to do them. And the good news is it's a whole lot cheaper for us as a country to do that if we invest in those opportunities, if we invest in those tools in our toolkit, than it is to continue just buying one more aircraft carrier and hoping that's going to solve our problem. We have to take a really big step back. The crises we're seeing right now in Afghanistan is a tragic reminder of the failure of a military-first foreign policy. It is the failure of 20 years of war and occupation. It is the result of trying to bring peace to people with bombs and bullets. It does not work. And if this doesn't force us to grapple with that, we have to have a long, hard look in the mirror and ask ourselves what will, because we really need to make sure this never happens again. We never want to be in a position again where we're having to go to extraordinary lengths to do the kinds of evacuations that we should be doing right now and we need to be doing right now. We have to understand the mistakes we made that got us to this place, and we have to make sure we never make those mistakes again.
Stephen, thank you so much. Stephen Miles from Win Without War. Jocelyn, final word, because I'm going to say bye to everyone as we have to get out a little early today.
I'm good. Yes, everyone, thank you so much. Have a great day.